World Regionals Geography 110, United States and Canada, Part 4. We're continuing with historical landscapes, the legacy of slavery. I think, when you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at racial relations in the U.S., these are all legacies of slavery. How our population sees itself, how we see different people within our group, depends on which side of the slavery issue you're on. And what I mean by that is that if you're a non-slave, if you had not been a slave or could easily be identified as someone who could have been a slave, i.e. black, then you tend to look at it one way. And if you are in that group, then you look at it another way. And that's still something we're coming to issue with. Now, I think that overall, I know in my lifetime I have seen a dramatic change in how people are treated and respected in the country as a whole, and the opportunities that exist. Um, I think that fewer people probably attempt to take advantage of some of the opportunities. I mean, my parents were farm laborers, and I had some opportunities that I took advantage of. And I think and it's not everybody sees that route as the best way to go. But a lot of what comes down in how we see blacks in general is the difference in development in the U.S. North and South. And I think you could throw in Canada in there. One of the things about Canada and the U.S. North in particular, while slavery was legal in those regions, it didn't really have a solid hold and become a dominant force like it did in the South. And part of the reason for that was that the northern part of the US and Canada in particular, because of climate, because of the geography, the land, the type of soils, the crops and the growing season, the climate, those areas did not lend themselves easily to being a agricultural commodities based economy. The southern part of the U.S., because of its climate, because of the soils, lent themselves very well to monocropping, which is there were only a few crops. Dominant crop was cotton. Before that, it was tobacco and indigo. Those crops could be raised in large farms with lots of slave labor, very labor intensive, and can be very profitable. You couldn't do the same thing in the north part of the U.S., and you couldn't do it in Canada because of the winters, because you were paying people for a lot of time when they were not able to do anything because of the weather. So you didn't see slavery take hold like you did in the South, even though it was legal. Um, Now, even before slavery was in the Americas, you had indentured servants. And actually, the first slaves in North America were white, not black. Indentured servants were contracted labor where, say, a person wanted to immigrate from England or Ireland or Europe in general, and they were willing to sign a contract to work for someone for a period of time, usually 7 to 10 years. They would work for a person. That person would pay for them to come to the New World, And then at the end of that 7 years or 10 years, they would be let out of that contract, and then they could go, and that's when they would go and homestead and build their little cabin in the woods and start farming, living their own life. Obviously, with slaves, they were owned, not contracted, and so consequently, they didn't have that opportunity. And that's probably the biggest difference in indentured servants and slavery. Now, the Spanish made a huge, they used a lot of Native American labor initially, but because of diseases and other issues, as the Native American population died off and the Spanish still needed labor for the mines and for the plantations, they began importing black labor, black slaves from Africa. And, black slaves had been shipped into Southern Europe and particularly into the Middle East for centuries from West Africa. So black slaves, or slaves in general in the Middle East, were not something that were uncommon. So it was natural that they went to just changing where they were sending that population of people that they were taking as slaves. And this established that Atlantic slave trade, triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, where finished goods would be shipped to Africa and to North America, and raw materials shipped from North America to Europe, and slaves shipped from Africa to North America and the Caribbean and Latin America. The settlement and industrialization's continuous frontier settlement. What we mean by that is that in the U.S. there was this constant western expansion till we reached the Pacific. In Canada, you had a western expansion also, but you didn't have as much colonizing moving. You didn't have the population. The winters were a little tougher. The climate was a little tougher. You did not have that huge population increase that you had in the United States. The United States, where Canada was initially French, which they did not do a lot to encourage increased colonization. The British, who took over Canada, you couldn't really grow a lot of crops there, so there wasn't, you didn't need a lot of people to be involved in the fur trade, so there wasn't a real need to have large amounts of people settled in Canada. And then you had the United States, which the Irish, who were trying to get away from the British, came to the U.S. first. Germans, because they would allow them in. French, because they would allow them in. And then Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, large groups of these people came to the U.S. Because they were allowed in. And that began that western expansion. If you wanted free land, you had to go to the west, and you could claim it under the land grant system. The Civil War changed the U.S. dramatically. When you had the U.S. At the Civil War, you began industrialized farming, the manufacturing at the beginning of the Civil War. The vast majority of the wealth in the United States was in the South. There was more value in the slaves that were owned in the South prior to the Civil War than there was in the factories, the manufacturing factories of the North. So the wealth was concentrated in the South, and it was mostly in the form of slaves. So when you think about the Civil War and the threat to slavery, it was really a threat to the wealth of the people that owned the slaves. what you saw during that short period of the Civil War, 4 years, was this incredible industrialization process that took place in the North, particularly in the Northeast, with gun manufacture, shoe manufacture, clothing manufacture, industrialization of agriculture with the introduction of the harvester had been around, the wheat harvester, but hadn't been really used because there was enough free labor that was relatively inexpensive to hire to work harvesting the wheat in the Midwest, and there wasn't it didn't pay for them to um, mechanize the harvest process. But with the Civil War came the need to feed these large armies, and the agricultural production exploded in the Midwest, and farmers turned to industrialized mechanization to harvest that wheat, and the production of the U.S. in wheat rose dramatically, enough that a third of the wheat feeding the British, that the British imported to feed their population, came from the U.S., from the northern states, even during the Civil War. It's one of the things that kept the British from recognizing the South. The other was that the British had already outlawed slavery, and so they were kind of hesitant to uh, recognize the South because of the slavery issue. There was a pretty strong movement in Britain to resist that. The North American Act was a British act in 1867, and it was really a response to the Civil War. The British were very afraid that the Americans, who had this large army, modern army, had changed warfare forever with the Civil War, the tactics and the strategies and the mechanization of the war, that they were going to turn their eye on Canada and sweep into Canada and conquer Canada and take it from Britain. And so the British decided that it would be better to create an independent country, which would be a little harder for the U.S. to go into. And so they had the North American Act of 1867, which basically created the Dominion of Canada. And so it made it less likely that the United States would invade. The economy, accumulation, and production of inequality. What we're talking about is distribution of wealth and inequality. There's two economies, Canada and the United States. Canada's model was a staples economy, which means they produce things like wood, timber, commodities that were sold on the world market. Canada's kind of unique in that it's one of the few countries that has succeeded and became a global economic power based on commodity production. The United States, which is far dominant economically, production-wise, is mostly an industrialized economy in this region up here, agricultural in this region. The wealth is here, agriculture's there. Now, California is an exception in that we're so strong, both in manufacturing and agriculture. This is kind of an interesting series of maps if you look at them. And it really kind of shows, this is 1860, just before the Civil War. This is the rail systems. As you can see, a lot of rail, very dense network there. Not so much down here.